That's, can you hear me now? Yes. By the way, if anyone does need additional help in hearing, we do have, I don't know what they're called, some devices out at the front counter that you can use if you need a little help in hearing what's going on. I owe everybody an apology, actually. I had really planned to be all excited and welcome you to fall. And here we are in the middle of summer still. I don't understand that. It's October. Move it closer. Move it closer. There's a little feedback there. Yep, no, there's still some feedback. No, if I move it closer, then I'm eating the damn thing. All right. How's that? That's better? I can yell too. I've got a theatrical voice. Anyway, I would hope to welcome you to fall, and that's going to come tomorrow or Friday, I am told, instead of a 100-degree day. But anyway, I'm glad that you're here to this October 2025 Lunch Talk series, and I think we've got a really fascinating one for you today. But before that, I do want to acknowledge our good friends at Friendship Village, because, yes, and we have one, yay! Friendship Village has been a great supporter of these lunch talks, and we really wouldn't be able to do it without them. So let me first introduce you to Mark Young, who's Director of Marketing, who's usually busy selling new apartments, he told me. And now there's a waiting list for the new ones that have yet to be constructed. So Friendship Village is alive and well. That's actually kind of another, yes, alive and well, and doing great things. So, Mark, you have a few words?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Vic. It's a pleasure to be here, as always. I apologize for missing the last one. We were busy selling apartments, plus 2 people on vacation and 2 people called off sick, so had to miss that one. Yeah, Friendship Village is such a gem, and we love sponsoring these talks. We love our residents attending these. I've learned so much. I've lived in Mesa most of my life, and I just learn so much every time I come here. So for me personally, it's great. For the residents, it's great, and we do appreciate Vic being invited back each year to sponsor this. So thank you very much. I'll be in the back if you want to learn more about Friendship Village. I hope you do. But I think most people here already know about us, but that's okay. We might have a thing or two to share with our expansion. So thank you very much, Vic. Appreciate it.
And Mark has privately told me that next year Friendship Village will sponsor at the $100,000 level. So we are really, that's only 1 or 2 apartments. Come on, it's not a big deal, and we're doing a lot. Of course, these lunch talks are streamed on Facebook Live and also on YouTube. And we've had to move things over from Facebook to YouTube for the archive of past lunch talks. So if there's one that you haven't seen and you'd like to know something about that speaker, go to YouTube and just the Tempe History Society, and you will find that. So let us begin with today, and our speaker is Dr. Matthew Sandoval, and I just met him, and I have to be honest, I really don't like him. Well, one, he's too young looking. You'll see that in a minute. And this guy is so busy. How old are you? You want to trade? 46. He looks like he's 23. But I could read a whole long bio, but let me tell you, this fellow has done so much. And if he looks familiar to you, it's because his focus is on Mexican and Chicano art and culture. He's worked with the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is not getting any funding right now, and that's presenting a real challenge. He is a public scholar. Been featured on PBS, NBC, Today Show, NPR, Washington Post, LA Times, and the Arizona Republic. And that's just one of the reasons I really don't like him. I've been featured, never mind, in the post office, if you want to see a nice photograph of me, and it shows how much I'm desired, that people want me, and I just try to be a moving target. But we don't invite people without great credentials, so take my word that he's one of the best. So please, and the subject today is really an exciting one, and very valuable, of course, for this time of the year. So without further ado, and he's at the back of the room, is going to run at a great speed to get through here, Dr. Matthew Sandoval. All right, there's another reason. I know you couldn't see him, but he's doing things I would do, and that's really, so you better really, we're expecting a lot from you, fella.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank
Thanks.
you so much, Vic. Thank you so much. I can honestly say in all my years of doing public talks, I've never had an introduction quite like that. So thank you, Vic. Thank you, everyone. I want to begin just by giving a special thank you to the Tempe History Museum, of course, the Tempe History Society, and a special shout out to Chris Marin, without whom I wouldn't be here and who has been an absolute inspiration for the work that I do. The work that I do as a professor at ASU would literally not be possible if it weren't for the legacy that she has created. So shout out to Chris. A little bit better. There we go. Is this okay? Is volume okay for you? Fantastic. Okay, so here we go, folks. You ready? You ready? Okay. Today's talk is Cinema's Impact on Dia de los Muertos traditions. I do a lot of different kind of research related to Dia de los Muertos. I study Dia de los Muertos in its Mexican context, which is to say usually every year I dip down to different parts of Mexico to study Dia de los Muertos. I also study it in its U.S. context, so I look at the way that Chicano communities in the United States celebrate Dia de los Muertos as well. And then I look at the way that Day of the Dead is represented in things like cinema or art exhibitions or literature and poetry and music. So I look at Dia de los Muertos from a holistic point of view. So this is just going to be a small snippet of the work that I do. So we're going to talk about Day of the Dead in relation to cinema today. Now, I have a feeling that many people are familiar with Dia de los Muertos, but I want to just begin by talking a little bit about the holiday itself. So for millions of people throughout Latin America, Dia de los Muertos is one of our most sacred and significant cultural traditions. Celebrated at the end of October and beginning of November, Day of the Dead allows us to honor our ancestors and our dearly departed through remembrance, through offerings, storytelling, ceremony, and festival. The holiday's cultural roots are actually incredibly complex. So first of all, Dia de los Muertos is celebrated or centered around the Catholic holy days, All Saints' Day on November 1st and All Souls' Day on November 2nd. But the holiday is not really exclusively Catholic. Day of the Dead's cultural roots are actually a mixture of customs from indigenous Native Americans, European Catholics, European pagans, North African Islamic mysticism, as well as West African animist religions. These diverse customs mixed together in Latin America during the first several centuries of Spain's colonization of the Americas. So I'm talking 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. In short, Dia de los Muertos has global roots that were forged in the fires of European colonization, African slavery, and indigenous genocide. Although myriad versions of this cultural tradition exist literally all over Latin America, most associate the holiday with Mexico and with Mexican national culture. And I'm going to talk a lot about why that is today. What I want to talk about is the way Dia de los Muertos has been depicted in cinema, because the influence of cinema on Dia de los Muertos has been nothing less than profound. Cinematic representations of Day of the Dead have significantly impacted the way Dia de los Muertos is seen and the way that Dia de los Muertos is imagined. Cinema has shaped how Dia de los Muertos is understood by millions and millions of people across the world, and cinema has significantly affected the way that Dia de los Muertos is celebrated by communities on both sides of the US-Mexico border. And this phenomenon is not a new one. It didn't begin with Disney's Coco, okay? Raise your hand if you've seen Disney's Coco. Okay, lovely. I am actually not going to talk about Disney's Coco today. I'm going to talk maybe about some films that you may not be as familiar with and talk a little bit about how they've impacted Day of the Dead. So we are going to rewind all the way back to the early 1930s. The impact that I'm talking about begins with the first movie to ever put Dia de los Muertos on film. That film is Que Viva Mexico by Sergei Eisenstein. Eisenstein was a Russian filmmaker whose early movies glorified the Soviet Union, communist principles, and told visually epic narratives about his nation for the masses. He's most notable as director of Battleship Potemkin. Anybody seen Battleship Potemkin, 1925? A handful of people, I love it. October, 1928. Anybody seen October? Nobody. Ivan the Terrible, 1945. A single person. Shout out to you, ma'am, for seeing this movie. By any metric, Sergei Eisenstein is one of the greatest filmmakers to ever bless cinema. If you were to take a film studies 101 course, the first director that you're actually going to learn about is Sergei Eisenstein. That's how big of an impact he's had. In addition to all his other accomplishments, he gave us the first cinematic representation of Day of the Dead. In 1930, Eisenstein traveled to Mexico to make a film called Que Viva Mexico, an epic film that would give an overview of Mexican history from ancient pre-Hispanic Aztecs to Spanish colonization to Mexican independence to Mexican Revolution to modern 1930s Mexico. In other words, several hundred years of Mexican cultural history condensed into a single movie. He was originally inspired to make the film after he saw photographs in a magazine of Dia de los Muertos folk art. So things like sugar skulls, calavera face paint, skull masks, and skeleton toys. His fascination with Day of the Dead drew him to Mexico, where he began researching the holiday. But in the early 1930s, there were really only two authors writing about Dia de los Muertos in Mexico. These were the Jewish Mexican anthropologists Pacator and Anita Brenner. Eisenstein met them, read their books, and used their research on Dia de los Muertos to write his movie script. In terms of visually depicting Dia de los Muertos, Eisenstein was deeply influenced by the famous Mexican painter Diego Rivera. People have heard of Diego Rivera? Okay, oh, that's great. Eisenstein actually spent a lot of time hanging with Diego Rivera and his wife, Frida Kahlo. People know Frida Kahlo? Is that a name? Okay. I figured we would get that one. Both Diego and Frida were among the first Mexican artists to actually depict Dia de los Muertos as a subject in their visual art. Ultimately, Eisenstein was influenced by Pacator, Anita Brenner, Diego Rivera, and Frida Kahlo. They shaped how he saw and understood Dia de los Muertos, and in turn shaped how he would depict the holiday in his film. In Eisenstein's Que Viva Mexico, Dia de los Muertos operates as the central theme, motif, and framework that allowed him to connect all of Mexican history together in a single narrative. In his film, Dia de los Muertos operates as the symbol of Mexico. The holiday becomes an embodiment of what we call Mexicanidad. That's going to be a key term for us today. Everybody say it out loud. Mexicanidad. Yo, y'all got to come with better than that. Mexicanidad. There we go. Hello. This is now I feel like I'm in the classroom. Now we're cooking. Now we're cooking. So the holiday becomes an embodiment of what we call Mexicanidad, or the essence, the spirit, the soul of what it means to be Mexican. So he creates this film as the symbol of Mexico. This despite the fact that in the early 1930s, Dia de los Muertos was far from a national holiday in Mexico. It wasn't even celebrated everywhere throughout the country. In fact, Dia de los Muertos really was a regional cultural tradition limited to central and southern Mexico only. But Eisenstein's film elevates the holiday to a symbol for the Mexican nation as a whole. This is one of the lasting impacts of his film. For most people around the world, Dia de los Muertos isn't Peruvian, it's not Bolivian, it's not Guatemalan, even though the holiday is celebrated in each of those nations. Rather, thanks to Eisenstein, Dia de los Muertos is understood as quintessentially Mexican. And I would say that 100 years later, that's still how most people tend to identify it. They think of it as a Mexican thing as opposed to a broader Latin American thing. That's thanks to Eisenstein. Eisenstein's Que Viva Mexico inspired the dynamic filmmaking duo of Emilio Fernandez and Gabriel Figueroa, who also sought to cinematically portray Dia de los Muertos and make it central to Mexican national identity. They did this in their internationally celebrated 1948 film, Maclovia. Has anybody seen Maclovia? Hands up if you've seen Maclovia. Hands up if you've seen any film from the 1940s. There's my people. There's my people. All right, cinema history junkies, let's go. How many of you have ever heard of Emilio Fernandez? A handful of people. I love that. Most people know him only as the model of the Academy Awards Oscar statue. So it's one thing to remember that every time, every Academy Award, when they hand the Oscar statue to somebody, they're handing a statue that's the embodiment of a Mexican filmmaker, actually. Let's go. Let's go. Emilio Fernandez is one or was one of the most celebrated directors in Mexican film history. Throughout much of his career, he collaborated with, young Emilio is such a stud. I love this dude. But for much of his career, he collaborated with cinematographer Gabriel Figueroa. They made a total of 24 films together. In the 1940s and 1950s, Fernandez and Figueroa made Mexico the epicenter for Spanish-language film industry, eclipsing Spain and Argentina at that time. Their films made the rounds at every major international film festival where they received critical acclaim, and over the course of their collaboration, their films were nominated for nearly 50 Ariel Awards, which are the Mexican equivalent of the Academy Awards. For both Mexican audiences and international audiences, the films of Fernandez and Figueroa defined Mexico and defined what it meant to be Mexican. As Fernandez famously put it, quote, "There exists only one Mexico, the one we invented through film." In 1948, Fernandez and Figueroa made their film Maclovia, a popular and award-winning movie starring Mexican movie star Maria Felix. Hubba, hubba. The story centers on the characters Maclovia and Jose, who try to maintain their love despite racial and class differences, a classic tale. The film is set on the island of Janitzio in the Mexican state of Michoacan. And the story of Maclovia and Jose unfolds during the island's Dia de los Muertos celebration. So Day of the Dead becomes a major part of the narrative and a key plot point for the movie. In fact, Fernandez and Figueroa's depiction of Dia de los Muertos becomes the film's most notable legacy. Now, the island of Janitzio is actually a real place. About 2,000 people live on this very tiny island. And the small island's Dia de los Muertos is a real event, which is actually known among the islanders as Noche de Muertos, Night of the Dead, because traditionally the community holds the majority of the ceremonies in the evening. But the filmmakers didn't shoot the movie during Janitzio's actual Noche de Muertos. They're making a fictional film, not a documentary, so they recreated their own version of Janitzio's Noche de Muertos for their film, using the island's villagers as the actors and as the extras. Now, for centuries, literally for centuries, the island of Janitzio's Noche de Muertos was exclusively for the 2,000 villagers themselves. Outsiders didn't come to the island on November 1st and 2nd to witness the community ceremony, but that changed dramatically after Maclovia was released. Thanks in large part to the film, the celebration started to be featured in travel magazines and tourist guidebooks in Mexico, the US, and Europe. This brought travelers from all over the globe to the tiny island to witness their picturesque Noche de Muertos ceremony in the cemetery. Within a couple decades, Janitzio's Night of the Dead event was a major cultural attraction, regularly bringing in now several thousand tourists each November 1st and 2nd. Fast forward to the 21st century, where Janitzio now sees, on November 1st and 2nd, over 100,000 visitors to their tiny island to witness this event, Noche de Muertos. And it is by far Mexico's most famous Day of the Dead event. If you were to Google top places to experience Dia de los Muertos, don't Google it now, Google it when you go home. You would find that Janitzio's Dia de los Muertos or Noche de Muertos would be among the top hits that you'd find. Fernandez and Figueroa's film made Janitzio's Noche de Muertos globally famous. Along the way, they also transformed it. First of all, this small ceremony that was once enacted exclusively by and for the community has become a large-scale cultural performance for tourists. Tourists come to Janitzio expecting to see what they saw on the big screen. Maclovia's impact has transformed the ceremony in other ways too. Noche de Muertos is now primarily geared towards fulfilling audience expectations. When tourists first started coming to Janitzio to witness the event in the mid-20th century, they had to stand around most of the day waiting for the evening ceremony to begin. Literally, boatloads of tourists hung out on the island looking at their watch and just waiting for something to happen. So in response, the villagers created a Day of the Dead cultural festival to entertain tourists until the actual ceremony began at night. This cultural festival is filled with folkloric dances, masked theater, and musical performances. What was once a small community ceremony grounded in ritual, religion, and solemn remembrance of the dead has transformed into a loud and boisterous spectacle. In recent years, more and more tourists come to the island in costume, masquerading as death and painting their faces like sugar skulls. Even though Janitzio's Noche de Muertos had never included any of these kinds of traditions, they are now central part of the tradition. So Maclovia, this 1948 film, is a classic example of how putting Dia de los Muertos on the big screen in front of millions of people internationally and in Mexico ultimately reshapes real-world celebrations of Dia de los Muertos. Okay, now I'm going to skip over 7 decades of cinematic representation just because we don't have time. I would love to spend the entire day with you to walk through all cinematic history, but we're going to skip right to 2015, okay? to talk about the film that I consider to have made one of the biggest impacts on the way that we understand Dia de los Muertos and the way that Dia de los Muertos is seen, celebrated, and understood. So this is the 2015 James Bond film Spectre. Has anybody seen, I'm assuming most people have seen James Bond. Have you seen the Spectre film? Raise your hand if you've seen 2015 Spectre. Oh, fall off. People used to be James Bond's fans, but when, well, not Daniel Craig fans maybe? I don't know, we'll see. At the outset, the filmmakers of the James Bond film Spectre wanted to start the movie with a sequence in which James Bond chases a villain through a Day of the Dead celebration in the middle of Mexico City. However, they were unable to film the scene during Day of the Dead season, so the filmmakers were forced to produce a fictitious Day of the Dead. Nonetheless, the filmmakers stated repeatedly that their intention was to create a Dia de los Muertos that was quote-unquote authentic, as well as quote-unquote spectacular. They opted to portray Day of the Dead as an enormous parade, even though Mexico City had never celebrated Dia de los Muertos as a parade. So this was hardly what we would consider quote-unquote authentic, but Spectre definitely made Dia de los Muertos spectacular. Spectre became Bond's most expensive opening scene in the entire franchise history. $25 million to make this opening scene, which was paid for by the Mexican government, by the way. That's a whole separate conversation. But it meant an increase in budget, scale, props, costume, and people. So just some figures here. This opening shot, and it literally is a 5-minute opening shot, 1,500 background actors. 60 costume designers created individual skeleton costumes for each of them. Calavera face paint was done by a crew of more than 170 makeup artists. The opening scene also included more than 350,000 bouquets of marigold flowers, 450 handmade masks, and thousands of Day of the Dead props. The film's Day of the Dead operated as a spectacle in terms of sheer size, too. In fact, it was so large that it required Mexico City to shut down the capital's entire historic center, some 4 square miles, for 2 weeks, just so that they could get this 5-minute scene. That's Hollywood for you, baby. In addition to creating the spectacle, the creative team tried to make their Dia de los Muertos as quote-unquote real and quote-unquote authentic as possible. For starters, that meant using real people to create Day of the Dead crowds rather than relying on computer-generated imagery or CGI. This helped make the scene appear as if the movie really was filmed during an actual Dia de los Muertos celebration. The filmmakers also tried to convince the audience that it was a quote-unquote authentic Dia de los Muertos by using certain cinematic techniques. Director Sam Mendes opted to give the movie's opening a documentary-like feel by filming it as a single continuous shot with no edits. However, this continuous shot is pure Hollywood magic. In actuality, the scene contains multiple nearly imperceptible cuts and edits. Spectre premiered in Mexico City on November 2nd, 2015. So they released this film on Dia de los Muertos in Mexico City. This was a way to secure an authentic bond between the movie and Dia de los Muertos. An authentic bond. Come on, people. I'm a recent dad. You got to give me some dad jokes. Thank you very much. Linking Spectre to Dia de los Muertos in the public imagination by scheduling the premiere to take place on the holiday was not enough, though. The producers actually infused the the Mexico premiere with components of Day of the Dead tradition. So skeleton costume musicians playing songs, troops of performers executing traditional dances while others performed in vaguely indigenous costumes. The red carpet for the premiere was decorated with giant skulls, skeleton props, and puppets, many of which had actually been used in the actual film. Additionally, a massive crowd, some 10,000 people in Mexico City, came on November 2nd dressed in skeleton costumes, calavera face paint, and La Catrina outfits, as if Spectre's premiere were an actual Dia de los Muertos celebration. In my mind, these kinds of cultural performances create a crisis with regards to Dia de los Muertos' identity. Were the tens of thousands of Mexican citizens who attended the premiere honoring and celebrating the dead as part of Dia de los Muertos? Or were they honoring and celebrating a Hollywood movie? Day of the Dead and its Hollywood representations are becoming so fused that it makes it difficult for us to make a distinction between these two. The movie's popularity ensured that an enormous global audience received spectacular visual imprints of what Day of the Dead is, what Day of the Dead looks like, and how Day of the Dead is celebrated. The film's version and vision of Dia de los Muertos, of course, was fictional, but it was about to become actual. The success of the James Bond movie led the Mexican government to recreate the movie's Day of the Dead parade as a real-life event in 2016. After all, they'd already invested $20 million in the film, so this was their opportunity to capitalize on their investment and deepen the country's association with the movie. Of course, promoting Day of the Dead as a tourist attraction was nothing new. For literally decades, Mexico has used Day of the Dead to entice travelers to visit the country and pour money into the national economy. In fact, when we think of quote-unquote authentic Dia de los Muertos celebrations, they're usually considered quote-unquote authentic because Mexico has spent decades and millions of dollars advertising them as quote-unquote authentic. Here I'm thinking of Mexico's promotion of Dia de los Muertos in places like Michoacán and Oaxaca. The 2016 Dia de los Muertos parade was different. Mexico's tourism industry wasn't exploiting an already existing traditional celebration, it was inventing a new tradition. Mexico's tourism minister held a national meeting with travel agents and tourism bureaus and stated, quote, "We have to invent the Day of the Dead Carnival because after this James Bond movie, tourists are going to come to Mexico looking for the carnival and they're not going to find it." In other words, Mexico needed to fabricate an already fabricated Dia de los Muertos parade in order to fulfill tourist desires and expectations. From the beginning, this Dia de los Muertos parade was designed to be a performance of Mexican national identity. Mexican president at that time, Enrique Nieto, inaugurated the parade by saying, quote, "We decided to project the best of Mexico, its traditions, its values, and promote Mexico extensively among Mexicans themselves and internationally," end quote. Mexico's tourism minister expressed great pride in the fact that the parade, quote, "had given Mexico enormous visibility," end quote. In other words, the purpose of their Dia de los Muertos celebration was to transmit a strategic, well-crafted image of Mexico for both local and global audiences. In this regard, Day of the Dead is performed as a large-scale visual advertisement for Mexico and Mexican national culture. Again, going back to this concept of Dia de los Muertos as Mexicanidad, thanks to Sergei Eisenstein. Staging the Dia de los Muertos parade as a spectacle was also a way to rebrand the holiday. The director of the parade stated, quote, "Though the parade did not exist in this format, it did exist in content and tradition and its looks. So it exists in this format. It's wonderful to be able to rescue that and bring it to a new format for Mexicans. We're really trying to find a new brand, a new identity for Dia de los Muertos." So rebranding of course, is a marketing term normally reserved for commodities. The implication, of course, is that Dia de los Muertos is a commodity, no different than Coca-Cola, no different than Nike, no different than your favorite breakfast cereal. It can be bought, it can be sold, it can be marketed, it can be branded, it can be rebranded. The other implication of Anaya's statement is that Dia de los Muertos' quote-unquote new brand should essentially be a Hollywood version. James Bond's Dia de los Muertos was an enormous, alluring, and visually spectacular image. So Mexican officials sought to craft a celebration that would be equally enormous, alluring, and visually spectacular. But it wasn't enough that the 2016 parade was inspired by the Dia de los Muertos from the James Bond movie. The parade's creators self-consciously attempted to simulate the Dia de los Muertos from the James Bond movie. The Mexican government even promoted the Dia de los Muertos event as a, quote, Spectre-style parade. To make it a quote-unquote Spectre-style Dia de los Muertos, many of the exact costumes, props, and floats from the movie were used in the 2016 parade. Again, in my mind, this creates a crisis of identity for Dia de los Muertos. On one hand, the 2016 parade was an entirely fictitious Dia de los Muertos tradition with absolutely no grounding in tradition other than the tradition of cinema. On the other hand, for the parade's audience, it was an actual Dia de los Muertos celebration that they really got to witness in real life and not in movie theaters. In fact, the 2016 parade might have even been more real than real because it satisfied their imagination of what Dia de los Muertos is supposed to be. Where what Dia de los Muertos is quote-unquote supposed to be is what Hollywood thinks it's supposed to be. The overwhelming success of the 2016 Dia de los Muertos parade in Mexico City led Mexican government officials to institute it as an annual event. Each successive year, the spectacle has become more elaborate, the crowd has grown in size, and the amount of profit generated has increased. 2019 marked the largest celebration with a whopping 2.6 million people attending the event. Mexico City's Independence Day, September 16th, by contrast, which is the country's premier national holiday, now pales in comparison to the Dia de los Muertos parade. The Hollywood simulation hasn't just become the ultimate Dia de los Muertos event, it is now the ultimate Mexican fiesta. Mexico expected to see even more visitors and host a larger Spectre-style parade in 2020, but the COVID-19 pandemic curbed tourism and nearly all celebrations in the country. Mexico City's Dia de los Muertos parade returned in 2021, but with a smaller attendance than before on account of safety measures and lingering health fears. When I attended the event in 2022, the event had returned to its previous popularity, with more than 2 million people in the streets participating in this new Dia de los Muertos tradition. Nonetheless, what began as an entirely cinematic tradition has now become an actual Dia de los Muertos tradition. And this idea of Dia de los Muertos becoming a kind of spectacle, something that people watch, something that's visually spectacular, has started to seep its way into all celebrations of Dia de los Muertos. So that now, regardless of where we're looking, whether it's Mexico City, whether it's Oaxaca, whether it's Michoacan, whether it's close to the border, whether it's Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, San Antonio, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, or in our own home here in the Valley, the emphasis on Dia de los Muertos has become less about honoring the dead and really more about making the event and festival visually spectacular and alluring and good for the photograph, good for cinema, good for social media. All of this is a product of Dia de los Muertos' representation of Day of the Dead, dating back almost 100 years now. So it's this slow accumulation of turning Dia de los Muertos into a commodity, into something that's visually spectacular, that really has informed the way that Dia de los Muertos exists for most communities, both in Mexico and the United States. But I do want to end my lecture today by talking about perhaps maybe something of a counterpoint, to look at the way that different communities have responded to the way that Dia de los Muertos is becoming increasingly marketed as this visually spectacular event, where the emphasis is always on its visuality, where the emphasis is on that Dia de los Muertos is essentially Mexicanidad. That counterpoint comes from a couple of artists here in the Valley. Do people know Carmen and Zarco Guerrero? Raise your hands if you know Carmen and Zarco. Fantastic. Carmen and Zarco are some of the most amazing movers and shakers that we have here in the Valley, and they have been for a very, very long time. I'm not going to get into the vast history of either of these artists, but they've been prolific. It begins when they start their organization known as Chican Indio out of Mesa, Arizona, back in 1975. Chican Indio started as a Mexican-American or Chicano arts organization dedicated to promoting and preserving Mexican culture, but also Native American culture. For them, the emphasis was always on combining local indigenous peoples along with Mexican-American peoples because they saw so many similarities in their cultural traditions. And so Carmen and Zarco, through the auspices of Chican Indio, began producing a Dia de los Muertos celebration here in the Valley back in Mesa's Pioneer Park back in 1980 was the first one. And it continued for nearly 26 years before it kind of petered out. One of the fascinating things about their version of Dia de los Muertos, even though that there are tons of photographs that exist, and the reason these photographs exist and can be known is thanks to our Chris back here, who bothered to archive these things back in the day. But one of the most notable things about their Dia de los Muertos is that it didn't make the focus Mexicanidad. It wasn't about performing Mexican national identity, even though that was a component. It was actually about turning Dia de los Muertos into a multicultural event so that all peoples, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, class, etc., could participate in the spirit of Dia de los Muertos, which is actually honoring one's ancestors and honoring one's dead, first and foremost. The other fascinating thing about them, or about their Dia de los Muertos, was, again, that it was multicultural. So they would bring in native performers from local tribal nations, whether it was the Salt River Pima Maricopa folks, whether it was people from the Navajo Reservation, people from San Carlos Apache Reservation, so that their Dia de los Muertos was always about being an inclusive event. Dare I say it was diverse, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can I say those words actually in Tempe? I don't know anymore. I might be censored after this. They're going to blank out the Facebook live stream now. So that it was even more than just including Mexican and Chicano artists to perform in their festival, and more than just indigenous performers. It was always about bringing in African and African-American performers like the Kawambe drum and dance ensemble to perform West African traditional ceremonies that also honored ancestors. So for Carmen and Zarco, it was about making this way more than just a Mexican thing and way more than just a visual emphasis on being good for photographs and video, etc. This has continued even though Carmen and Zarco no longer run Chican Indio. That organization has shifted. They've started their own organization known as Cultural Coalition. They still produce a Dia de los Muertos, although they've started to move away from actually calling it Dia de los Muertos. So they now call their event Miquixli, which in the Nahuatl language of indigenous Mexico, indigenous central and southern Mexico, means transition. So they've regrounded it and started to move away even from the name Dia de los Muertos, in part because of cinema's impact. So in 2013, you guys, there were a lot of hands up here that said that they had seen Disney's movie Coco. In 2013, when Disney first started making that movie, they filed a patent claim with the US Patent Office to trademark the phrase Dia de los Muertos, Dia de Muertos, and Day of the Dead. So Disney literally tried to trademark Dia de los Muertos, this deep cultural tradition, because they were making this movie and they wanted to make sure that they could corner the market on that thing, which of course led to a lot of fallout, right? So because Dia de los Muertos in the US specifically is really becoming very commodified, very commercialized, etc., we have groups like Carmen and Zarco's Cultural Coalition, and this is happening across the United States elsewhere, where people are starting to move away from even referring to their event as Dia de los Muertos, because Dia de los Muertos in the public imagination means those cool little tchotchkes that you can buy at Walmart and Target. It has less to do with honoring ancestors anymore. So they have changed their event a little bit, but they still keep it very multicultural. That spirit of Dia de los Muertos hasn't changed. It's not about celebrating Mexican national culture or Mexican national identity or thinking of Dia de los Muertos as a Mexican thing. For them, it's a deeply intercultural thing. And that's actually one of the reasons why our homegrown Dia de los Muertos event here, through whether it was Chican Indio or Cultural Coalition, remains really distinct in regards to the way Dia de los Muertos is celebrated by other communities across the United States and indeed throughout the rest of Latin America. That it really is in our own homegrown valley community where Dia de los Muertos is multicultural and still really attached to its sacred tradition of honoring ancestors. Okay, now in the spirit of commercialization, I would like to remind you that I'm selling my book. I'm happy to take questions. I think maybe that's where we should lead next. Vic, are you running the microphone?
Yes.
Okay, you're going to have to excuse Vic because he is incredibly slow at his old age. So it's going to take a while for him to get to you.
Now, just a minute. Now you know why I don't. Now you know what. See, he's got the control over this.
Yeah.
Now you know why I don't like them. I mean, a great presentation, a bad sense of humor,
Very much
and
so.
then he's very insulting. So,
I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the presentation, any questions
yes.
you might have about
Let me
Dia de los
start here.
Muertos in general.
Yeah, Chican Indio is still exists in an organization called Chico.
Of course, yeah.
You're aware of that?
Yeah, of
All
course,
right.
yeah. It has a different mission, different board of directors, a lot has changed, but yeah.
Thank you. Have you done any comparisons between Day of the Dead and Mardi Gras? Because very similar in the way of religious, pagan, etc., and commercialization.
Yeah, you know what's so funny? I'm so glad you asked that question. I've never had that question before.
And let me just say that's another reason I don't like this gentleman, because that was on my
I
list
don't think
to
Vic
ask
likes
you.
anybody who's here. I have. You know, actually, the way that I began studying Dia de los Muertos, I'm Chicano. But the way that I began studying Dia de los Muertos was actually by studying Mardi Gras. So when I was in graduate school doing my master's research at New York University back in the day, we used to go down to New Orleans during Mardi Gras to study Mardi Gras as a cultural performance. And it was through those kinds of experiences of thinking through these large-scale cultural traditions in different way and the legacy that led me to turn the spotlight onto my own culture. So only through studying the way that cultural traditions exist elsewhere that I got really, really interested in more of the history. So I've done a lot of comparative work with Mardi Gras and Carnival down in Brazil as well.
So the comparison is your next book?
It's probably 2 books from now, because I've got this book, I've got another book on the way from University of Arizona Press, and then a 3rd book, which is going to be about the presentation. that I gave
Another
today about
reason
cinema.
not to like this guy, I just don't understand. Let me ask, what do you, Hollywood, of course, exaggerates pretty much everything. What led Hollywood to getting into this kind of grotesque representation of Day of the Dead? I would assume that it was really a solemn rite originally to honor those
sure.
that had passed.
For sure. I think a lot of it had to do with that first representation of Dia de los Muertos from Sergei Eisenstein, because the way that he depicted it had very little to do with what I would call the traditional elements of Dia de los Muertos. So there were no ofrendas that were a part of his vision. There was no honoring of the ancestors. For him, it was all about the skull masks and the skeleton attire. That to him was like visually alluring, so he wanted to concentrate on that. And that gave Hollywood the insight that, oh, that's what Day of the Dead is. It's about skeletons and skulls and this kind of macabre thing. So part of it had to do with that. So I blame a Soviet-Russian filmmaker.
Hollywood has not had the greatest influence on how we look at things in our society. One more, I think, we can do.
How has Day of the Dead affected our Memorial Day? In some communities, I know they have gotten to be more of an event, but I grew up in a village in Wisconsin, right next to a very small city, and we would have a parade, but it always honored the soldiers and some of the important families that had helped settle the area and this type of thing. And of course, individual families did their own thing at the cemeteries. So,
Yeah, that connection between Memorial Day and Dia de los Muertos. In the United States, it's such a, I mean, there are history heads here, so maybe you might be interested in this history. But early in the 20th century, when Mexicans were first starting to begin to migrate into the United States, they didn't necessarily carry the tradition of Dia de los Muertos with them across the border as they settled in these new lands. And so Dia de los Muertos, for many Mexican Americans, kind of not quite disappeared, but I would say kind of went underground so that it wasn't about celebrating in public. Instead, what they would do, and I'm talking many Mexican American families, and this is actually very true in the Midwest, so I'm thinking specifically here about Dia de los Muertos among Chicanos in Illinois, in Wisconsin, and in Michigan, would actually celebrate a version of Dia de los Muertos on Memorial Day because that what was considered culturally acceptable. So they would show up to the cemeteries and actually decorate the graves the way that they would on traditionally November 1st and 2nd. That was incredibly popular in the Midwest, if for no other reason also than November 1st and 2nd in the Midwest is cold as hell. And ain't nobody trying to go out and make anything on their cemetery. So part of it was like moving the tradition, keeping the spirit of the tradition, but moving it to a very different day. And there's a long history of that in the Midwest specifically, actually. So there is a real relationship in U.S. history among Memorial Day and Dia de los Muertos among Chicano communities.
I want you to think in your head your vision of a tenured university professor. Scholarly, a tie. In fact, I had a friend who was a history professor at ASU, and Michael Crow called him and said, "You have to wear a tie." So he went out to yard sales and bought these big, ugly ties. But I couldn't let this go by without showing you this university professor's shoe. Can you capture that? Brianna?
These are actually Nike's 2022 Dia de los Muertos shoes, believe it or not. So as much as I criticize Nike for commercializing Dia de los Muertos, they also make some pretty kick-ass shoes.
Well, I can tell you, Dr. Sandoval will probably never be invited back as long as I'm doing this.
Fantastic.
I want to thank you so much. Don't go away here.
Yeah.
First, let me show you the book. And I'm told that it just was published on Monday.
Published yesterday.
Yesterday. It's very hot. Yes, it's hot, off the press. So Dr. Sandoval will be over at the table there if you want to get that. And then, as a tradition, we always try to get something that to commemorate the speaker's visit. And unfortunately, I couldn't find anything for the Day of the Dead. I could drop dead here, and then you could carry me home. But as best I could come. I've talked about him a lot. Richard Nearing, who is a great pen and ink artist in Tempe, did so much great work. He passed away a few years ago, and his family gave us all of the materials that Richard had done. So this is a piece that was done by Richard in '91 called The Good Old Days, and it's 84 of 100. So we'd like to present that to you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
And then this is a token of our appreciation. Don't cash it all at once. That'll be... So I'm going to give these books to Dr. Sandoval, and he will be over at that table. Let me just point out a few things. We have a little bit of time left. Let me go to... Yeah, the other one was kind of having feedback. Speaking of Dia de los Muertos, there will be a celebration here on October 29th at 6 p.m. and a Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead altar will be featured here, honoring 700 years since the founding of Mexico. And come on, give me the Mexican pronunciation. Yes, yes, very good. I like you a little better now. And there'll be refreshments and... Oh, it's in partnership with the Consulate of Mexico, so, and it's free, so you might want to come to that. Also, coming up in November, just about a month and a week from now, is our Tempe Legends celebration. That is something that we've been doing for many years, and we're honoring people who have made significant contributions to the city in which they live. It doesn't necessarily mean political people. It can be educators. There are all sorts of folks, some whose names you haven't heard of, but nonetheless have done a lot in this city. And that is November 15th from 6 to 8 p.m. You can get tickets at the counter, and then you don't pay a fee. It's also on Eventbrite, which charges, I don't understand this anymore. You know, you can go to the Taylor Swift concert for $5, but the fees are $9,221.30. It makes no sense to me at all. Some other things that are coming up. That was last weekend. October 18th, the city has been, they are responsible for 4 historic properties in the city. And now, on a rotating basis, they're being opened to the public free. And the next one is the Eisendrath House from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. On College Avenue. Has everybody been there, or you haven't been there? Okay, it's worth, and there's some docents that are giving tours and that sort of thing. Did you want to? Oh, I don't have that flyer. When is it? November 2nd. Yes, Tardiata. We don't have that flyer on the table, but, pardon? It's online. They haven't used it before. Yeah. November 2nd from 12 to 8. November? It's going to be giant out in the plaza and in the museum. Yeah. You'll see the altar there at that time, too. Speaking in the background, and nobody can see her, and we lost our slideshow, but I want to recognize Brianna for all of her work. She does so much behind the scenes, but she also runs. This is a former librarian who came to the museum to interact with the community and now has become a producer and director of our lunch talks and manages to run all of the cameras and that sort of thing and does an absolutely great job. And also Hans Olsen will be here on the 17th of October, and he will be signing a new book. We had him, was it last year, for Legends, and he was a huge hit, and he is one of Tempe's legends. So there's a lot happening, and God knows why, but everything is free at the museum. And if they try to charge you, tell them I sent you, and they'll give you a discount. Next month, November 12th, Dr. Summer Chairland will be doing a talk on where is South Phoenix in 4 stories. South Phoenix is close to Tempe, and all of the valley is really interrelated. When everything started, it was all agricultural, and it's really been diluted by the diversity that started all of this. So that's it. I think the book you'll find to be very interesting, and it's just a small one, so you can read it very fast and try to pick up a copy before it all goes away, and then it's on eBay for $200. With that, I thank you, and we will see you next month.